Hello viewers! Today we're going to talk about the opening, which is the first part of a chess game. If you have been following along with our How to Beat Beth Harmon series, you know you want to control the center and bring out your pieces, and you also want a castle, bring your king to safety. Those are your big goals out of the opening. So I found some lines for you guys to learn that are very simple and sound, so you're not going to be overwhelmed with complications, but you still get a decent position. So let's start with pawn to e4. So the coordinates over here tell you the names of all the squares. So this is e4. So you're preparing to bring out some pieces and you're also controlling the center. Now what if they copy you and play e5? Next step would be playing knight to f3. Bring out a piece, attack the center. If they insist on copying you, here's how you can punish them. So you take the pawn, and then they take your pawn. You play queen to e2. Now if they keep copying you, it's going to end badly. So queen e7, you take the knight, and now your knight is defended, so you're already winning. If instead they retreat their knight, here's a very nasty trick. This one's called a discovered check. So right now the black king is not in check because your knight is blocking your queen. So what you do is you move the knight away, and that's going to reveal a check from the queen, and that's why it's called discovery, or discovered check. So while they're busy getting out of check, your knight's going to be able to just take the queen next move. So bishop e7, then you take the queen, and you're already winning. So that's how you punish copycats. So if they don't copy you, they'll probably prefer to play the knight to c6, so they're developing a piece and defending the pawn. So now I recommend playing what's called the Spanish game. That's bishop to b5. So the idea is we can chop off this knight and then later on take this pawn. So the most common reply here is to actually invite you to do that, playing a6 to attack your bishop. When you get more experience and want to look at more complicated things, you can look at retreating the bishop, but for now, let's keep things simple and just chop the knight. And they recapture. Now, you actually do not want to take the pawn right away. If you do, then they can play queen d4, and now they're hitting both your knight and the pawn, so they're going to recover the pawn and just be fine. So I recommend playing knight to c3 instead. Now that the pawn has got some reinforcement, you really are threatening to take this guy. So they protect it, and they can play d4, grab the center. After some trades, we have this position. Your basic plan here is to trade a lot of pieces and then start pushing your pawns over here. So you'll play this at some point, not right away because it can be a bit loosening if you do it too soon. And in the very long term, you eventually go there. So what you're trying to do is use your majority over here, your 4 against 3, to try to create a passed pawn and create a new queen eventually. Now black's 4 pawns over here are not able to do the same thing because these guys are doubled. So that's your long-term plan. You can't do this immediately, but just trade a lot of pieces first, and then if you get down to just king and pawns, then you can start pushing these guys, and the endgame will look very good for you. So, stepping back for a bit, black doesn't always play a6. There are some other moves here. One of the more complicated ones is playing f5. This one is called the Schliemann. The simplest solution is just play d3, reinforce your pawn there. You can eventually play bishop c4 because black has weakened this diagonal. Now, some other moves black can play, the same general plans work against a lot of these systems. So if black plays, for example, d6, you can castle, bring your king to safety. If they attack your pawn with knight f6, you usually want to defend with the rook in the Spanish game. That's because you want to reserve this square for the pawn. So if they say bishop d7, you play c3, and now you're preparing to play d4 and grab the center. your pawn c3 is giving some reinforcement, so you can take back with a pawn if they capture on d4. They'll get a nice center and even a small advantage. So another reply is that black can play knight to f6 immediately here in the Spanish game. In that case, I recommend just castle. And if they take your pawn, the simplest solution is you can play rook t1, attacking the knight. And if they go back, you can regain the pawn. So perhaps you're wondering, wait, doesn't that just drop the bishop to knight takes b5? I'm actually not worried about that. Pause the video here for a moment and see if you can figure out why I'm not worried about knight takes b5. So the reason is, again, a discovered check. The king is not in check right now because my knight is blocking my rook, but if I play here, now the king is in check from the rook. Black's got to get out of check somehow, and while he's busy doing that, there goes the queen, you're winning. So black's not going to take the bishop. They'll probably play like bishop b7 or something, and then castle, but in that case you're fine. You have a decent position out of the opening. You're not getting wiped out in the first 10 moves. So that's how we handle pawn to e5. So there are lots of other moves black can play as well. So he could play what's called the French defense, pawn to e6. The idea is that they're going to reinforce the square d5, so now you can play here to challenge your e-pawn on the next move. The simplest solution is just to take the pawn with e takes d5. If you get more advanced and want to get more complicated things, you could also play pawn to e5. You could play knight c3 or knight d2, but let's keep things simple, not overwhelming with complications. Then they take it, and now let's bring out a bishop and control some squares. They do the same, and now we'll bring out a knight, and we'll castle kingside. And we'll bring the rook over to e1. Rooks like open files. We'll bring the knight out to d2, and the bishop will probably come out to g5 or something like, say, knight f6. We'll play over there. May not right away, but eventually. And sometimes you see white play the bishop back to g3 to challenge this guy. So there are some basic plans to help you get started. On a very good day, you might get to play knight e5 at some point. So that's how we handle the French defense. There's also the Caro-Kann. That's pawn to c6. It's a very similar idea. Black is reinforcing d5 so they can challenge your pawn. So here I recommend the main line, knight c3, the most popular move in this position. And then if we trade pawns. And there are a couple moves that black can play here. Sometimes you'll see black play knight to f6. In that case, I recommend let's just take it, and they can take over there. This is not very popular among professional players, but among amateurs, there are a bunch of people who will try this against you. What they're hoping for is they want to bring their rook to the g file so that when you eventually castle someday, they're going to have an attack on your king. So here's how you neutralize that. First thing you want to do, reinforce your center. And then after bishop f5, we play the knight out. And then after that, we'll play g3. And the bishop will come here, and we'll castle. So the idea behind this system is that when we play the pawn at g3, that's going to blunt black's attack when he tries to do this kind of stuff. It's not going to have any bite. And your bishop will give your king some extra protection, so you'll be fine. So that's how we handle that system. So just to recap, the Caro-Kann, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, trade pawns. So instead of playing knight f6, the most popular move is bishop to f5, attacking your knight. So let's bring the knight to safety and also attack the bishop by playing knight to g3. The bishop retreats. Let's bring out another piece and maybe go to e5 if black is not careful. Black usually, though, is careful, and I'll play knight d7 to reinforce that e5 square. So now let's go back to harassing the bishop. h4, dreaming of h5, which would actually put the bishop in a tough position. So black makes some room for the bishop. We chase it. Bishop retreats, and then we trade it off. So this is the main line of the Caro-Kann. So there are a couple things you can do here. So sometimes play the bishop out to f4 eventually. I play the bishop back to d2. Actually, in one of the lines I play the bishop out to f4, and then after queen to a5 check, I could bring it back to d2. So those are some things to think about. You'll castle queenside, and then probably bring your rooks to the center, rook d1, and then advance your knights with knight e4 and knight e5. You'll want to bring your king over to b1 just to get some extra safety. On c1, your king is still kind of close to the center because we said earlier in the series that the players want to fight for control of the center. You want to make sure your king is well away from any of that, so you're not going to fall into any sudden attacks. So that's how we handle the Caro-Kann. So there are some other moves you have to know about. We'll talk about those in our next episode, so be sure to tune in and subscribe so you don't miss that.